My name is Sharon Arnold. Hello, and I'm here to interview Lakshmi Muirhead for her exhibition, As If. I'm an essayist and independent educator, sometimes curator. My work is in weaving social philosophy and cultural theory around art, artists, and enchantment of the surrounding world through the lens of queerness and reconnection to ancestral cultural lifeways.
I'm Lakshmi Muirhead. I'm an abstract artist, and I'm here this morning to talk to Sharon about my new show at Judith Reinhardt's gallery called As If. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you all for being here too. Let's begin with your title, As If, and its context as a phrase in your life as it's related to this body of work. We share a generation, and I know that for myself, this phrase brings up a lot of things. For me, as a declaration of both assertiveness, but also defiance, which of course I love. But the phrase itself is also a device to pull forward or draw together things, different things through simile. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what this phrase means to you personally.
You're right that it is sort of a wink to our generation. I have such strong memories of saying that all the time. I mean, incessantly at a certain age, and I think it's one of the phrases that's just remained in my sort of unspoken response to the world. Like, I oftentimes find myself hearing things and thinking things and responding to things and to people inside my head, sort of like eye rolling and saying, as if. And I've had a few solo shows now, and I guess it's become my routine that I choose a title of one of the pieces that sort of, to me, embodies or best represents what was going on for me when I made the body of work. My first solo show in 2013, it was called Nobody, and it was the title of one of the pieces. And it felt, to me at the time, it really felt relevant to how I felt as an artist. I sort of felt like a nobody in the sense of that I was just really new to showing and making work. A couple years ago here with Judith, I had a show, and the title of the show was There's Always a Before, which was one of the piece's names. I made that work during 2020 and very much felt like, I don't know, the work felt really heavy. It felt serious. Now I think, there just is a lot going on for me, and there has been in the past year that I've made this work. I think there is defiance. There is a feeling of, I don't know, sometimes I feel sort of cynical, but I also feel like As If is very funny to me in a way. And when I come into the studio, or when I'm thinking about my work, I'm working really hard to cultivate like a feeling of sort of repudiating anything that might be going on in my head or in my mind about limitation. And As If always feels like a long-standing internal mantra, sort of about like, no, 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 just kind of a constant contrarian sort of drumbeat. And that's useful to me. I feel like it clears my head and gives me a lot more sort of liberty when I'm making the work. I think also, though, I am saying to myself most of the time, act as if, whatever I want my intention to be. And, to be 48, talking about our ages and that expression, but to be 48, obviously, and of course, there are things in society or culture or in life that are limiting to me. But I think what I'm working on most of the time is trying to resist self-limitation. And so, when I'm in the studio, or when I'm thinking about the work that I want to make or the things that I want to do, I am saying to myself, I'll act as if you're an artist. Act as if you have the freedom to make what you want. Act as if you have the space and the time and the luxury. And by the way, all of those things are true. I do have the space and the time and the luxury and the privilege and all of that in order to, you know, pursue like my aesthetic interest. So it is very much like a reminder. Act as if this is your work. Act as if this is a gift. Act as if you can do whatever you want. You know, that all of that is in it.
That makes a lot of sense. So that leads into my next question so beautifully about the way you speak of your work as a liberatory practice, and establishing a space of liberation for yourself. What is that, and what does it mean to you? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How does it show up?
Oh, that's a good question. One thing I could say about it is this: as I just said, there are things that I think as I get older and more self-aware, I'm able to see. I'm able to see the way that I've sort of internalized some of the things that you're sort of taught or, you know, infer, and to be able to just create space and within that space to say, I'm going to just allow my interest or my intention to be whatever it is, feels very liberatory. So with no concern about, you know, as someone who works in abstraction, I do oftentimes, when I'm most liberated, feel like, but this doesn't have to have any sort of meaning as such. Like I can pursue texture, and I can pursue, you know, a visual aesthetic, or I can pursue conceptual ideas. And it really is up to me, I find, to like defend that space or that mindset. I think a lot about, I'll say this, and this is maybe a little tangential, but I think sometimes about like my lineage, not just artistically, and of course there's, you know, an enormous precedent and lineage of Black abstractionists, American abstractionists, but I also think specifically about like my grandparents and the cultures that I'm of and from, and you know, my two grandmothers. So my maternal grandmother was a Black woman who lived on the south side of Chicago, had grown up in North Carolina and came north in the Great Migration. Worked in civil service for her career. So was a worker. You know, Black women we were workers, and raised children, and also did things like she was a prolific. She sewed clothes and got patterns, and it was something that she did a lot of, and was very meaningful to her. And I don't do that, but you know, I think about that. I think about the idea that oftentimes I'm in the studio making work it's not functional. It doesn't provide, there's no use for it. Do you know what I mean? It hangs, or we look at it, or we think about it, or it sort of, for me, hopefully is going to evoke a feeling in me. And then my paternal grandmother was a white woman who grew up and lived her life on a farms in farming country outside of Chicago, and was always working. You know, there was never not working. Everything was to be done. And so I have moments where I do think, what does it mean that 2 generations later I'm in this studio for 8 hours laboriously putting layers of paint on something. And I don't know, I have a lot of questions, I have very few answers the older I get, but I do feel like there is something liberatory about that. There is something about being able to do something or pursue something that is not about paid or unpaid labor necessarily. It's about something else, if that makes any sense.
Isn't there something liberatory about the labor of creating, you know, and having the ability to do that, and it's not towards someone else's capital?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I certainly, you know, I live in a household, I have children, there are tons of things that sort of fall into that category of like work that needs to be done, of course, and by no means do I do as much as many people do, but it is entirely, it feels like freedom to let your mind be expansive and have time to sort of let it unfold and go where it will. Definitely.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Absolutely. There's so much more. I feel like we could talk about that for the whole time, but to the paintings themselves, you talk about this shift in scale and how it shifts your physical movement and engages the whole body in this work. So how does the way you move your body dictate form and movement in larger works, not just in like the obvious way, but which would be physical exertion and painterly gesture and all of that, but also in the way that you're thinking about things as you go?
You know, I find like in my life, my adult life now, there are like these really predictable ways that I use my body. It's really static. It's usually fairly contained, unless I'm doing something kind of novel. But, you know, when I go into the studio, I feel sometimes more as I remember feeling and observing my kids, remember feeling as a child, you know, where you'd sort of find yourself just less inhibited and less, absence of self-consciousness sometimes. And you'd sort of have something, like a great classic example would be, you know, you're trying to get up to the top of the cabinet to wherever the blank is hidden, and you would use like a stool and a chair and the counter and your tippy toes or whatever to just like get to the cookies or get to the end or whatever. And sometimes in the studio, I think when I'm working grand or working large, or I'm working taller than I am or longer than I am or wider than I am, or I have to like crouch down for a really long time to like get the tiny little strokes at the end of the thing or whatever, I do feel like it pushes me. I'm less self-conscious, I'm less contained, I'm less aware of myself. I feel like it's just a physicality that underscores that idea of like, I do whatever I want here. I'm not being watched here. I'm not being observed. I'm not being critiqued. And I'm the only person here. You know, sometimes I definitely have that feeling where I'm like, I'm the only person here right now. So if I want to move these 3 panels or suspend them or something, like I'm gonna have to figure that out. And it absolutely influences my thoughts and ideas about what I can make, because I'm more expansive and more creative in the way that I'm using my body, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because the danger is to over-intellectualize as you go.
Totally.
Otherwise, right? But if you're in the body, you're really just in this moment, one moment to the next.
Or if I, if I'm working smaller, contained, like I've done a lot of figure drawing, and I love drawing and I love the repetitive movement, but it's a micro movement really, unless I'm sort of standing and, you know, there's kind of maybe a repetitive motion to the easel, away from the easel, but it is, I already feel like it's already limited, you know, and I think oftentimes when I'm in the studio, I don't want to feel any limitation.
This may be redundant, but sometimes I like to ask the questions in a way that sort of teases out other things. And so we're talking about the history of labor in your lineage, the history of labor in painting, the physical movement of your body. So what does labor mean for you in the way that you take and make time for labor, to work with your hands, to labor towards the end of a material result?
I think of the time in the studio as like my work or my job. And I mean, economic frameworks aside, like that is the way that my brain works. And so I have always set my hours, and they tend to be like 9 to 5 type hours. I've just never been the type of person who's like working at 3 a.m. and I'm absolutely never waiting for inspiration, as it were. I always have tasks. I always have, if I'm starting a new series, I will sort of create some loose framework that I'm kind of working within, but then I will have tasks for the day. And then within that, then things start to unfold, but I never expect to arrive. I don't wait to feel compulsion to be there to start working. I just start working. For me, there is something that tends to be very, very compelling about repetition of mark making, and I will just sort of kind of shift into like a period of time when I'm just sort of fixated on making a certain kind of mark, and that's usually what happens within like the span of a series. So like one thing that's interesting, and it just came to my mind thinking about my grandmothers. When I was a kid, my mother, she's not retired, but she was an English professor and had an office on campus. We lived right by the campus of the university she taught at, and her office was a room within like a converted house, a turn of the century house was like the English department. And then my aunt, who is a known and accomplished abstract painter, had a studio space separate from their home that was her workspace. And I've thought about it so much as an adult, with hindsight, like I loved going into their workspaces, and I knew that they did work there, and I just have such sense memory and around like what it looked like in both of those spaces and what it smelled like and all the little things that were there. But I definitely also think it really made an impression on me that like we as families, my aunts and my own, and we were very kind of, did a lot of communal things. We really respected their work. So like if my mom was at her office, she was working. She was working, and that you'd need to have a reason to call her or interrupt her. And same with my aunt. When she was in the studio, she was working, and it was established, it was delineated. That was not normal time. That was like their work time. And I feel like I do the same thing with my work time. I've been doing that for the better part of a decade. It's like my work hours, I'm working and I'm not available, and it delineates from all the other minutes and hours of the day that I am available. And I just think as far as how how I'm able to make work, I do think of it as labor. I think of it as a job. It's not a hobby. My hobbies are like Netflix and Formula One and texting things to my children, but it's my work. And so I do have like a lot of rules around it and structure around it to sort of keep me focused.
And on the days when you're not really feeling, we all go through that, I don't care about discipline, I don't want to be disciplined. How do you pull through?
I always say, it's funny, I just texted this to Josh, my husband, yesterday when he asked how it was going. Like in my head, I call that like the grind. I'm just grinding. I just do it anyway. If it's scheduled, I just go in there and I work on something. I either work on pieces that I'm in the midst of, or if I need a break from that, I do lots of little studies and sort of try different materials. This is usually outside of my sort of work or studio time, but I will, if I need to, I'll have a day where I spend the morning just researching and reading and looking at other work, or I'm oftentimes like studying conceptual things at any given time that will find its way into my work. So I just do it anyway. I tell myself, I've worked other jobs, and like you just go to the thing and you do the thing, and so I treat it the same way.
There's always something, right? Yeah. All the back burner projects or ideas to explore, things like that. And I imagine a lot of those studies become work later
They
on.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of nice to just go back through the work and the studies.
See what was interesting. Yeah.
You're like, oh, but did I think of that? Did I do that? So your forms are always somewhat sculptural, and I know that I sort of think about them as like they're reminiscent of like deep time striations of earth, and they share media used in sculpture making. And I know that among your interests are architecture, construction, and materials. So I was curious about that investigation and how it changes the way that you look at your painting.
I am interested in architecture. I'm very interested in sculpture. How to say? I think that, you know, there's like a feeling, maybe a few, maybe it's not one exclusive feeling, but there is a feeling that I'm looking for when I'm making work. There's kind of a moment with a lot of the pieces that I sort of feel like the inquiry or whatever is resolved because I feel a certain way. It's either, it's usually like close, it's somewhat like an excited feeling as opposed to kind of a contented. I mean, sure there's an amount of contentment, but it's more like you sort of feel awake or alive or invigorated or, and I've always felt that way about certain space. And it's disparate. It's not like there's one type of architecture I respond to. I just think my whole life, and I'm not suggesting this is all unique to me in the least, but you know, to go into certain buildings or have light look at a certain way on sort of like a stone or a glass, or to be in kind of public space that sometimes just, you know, leaves you feeling a particular way. Like that is, I crave that type of stimulation. And with, you know, I do make paintings in the sense that like I'm working on canvas or I'm oftentimes working on plywood and I'm applying layers of something to them. But I think I'm trying to evoke for myself a feeling that sometimes great sort of bigger or broader buildings or structures like leave me feeling. I especially in this series, you know, I love a linear mark. I love something that's very nuanced and looks like there is a history or, you know, residue, either literal or otherwise. A lot of the materials in sort of building are so interesting to me. All the different types of plaster, obviously I always work with plaster, or putty or adhesives, or, you know, all the different tools for like sanding and buffing and marking. And I just kind of like the tactileness of all of that. And then aesthetically, I like the way that it all sort of can look in its final stage. I mean, my hope is to do more in sculpture. You know, talk about liberation. I feel like in my mind I'm thinking a lot about sculpture, and I don't feel as liberated yet in my willingness to kind of like take some risks around that. But it's very, very compelling to me.
I could really imagine the leap. But there's something about the expansiveness in the specificity of a painting, in that like you think, oh, well, how is a painting expanding beyond the frame? But the container is where you sort of, it bleeds away and you get lost within it. And when I look at your work, I see sort of all of these striations or scars or residue or patinas, but also light and shadow very clearly. So I'm thinking, as you're talking about like certain times of day when the light is really long, and the surface of a building, its stones or tiles become sort of a bas relief in shadow and light. And I sort of see that a lot in this work.
It's good to hear. I think about that a lot. I definitely am drawn to that.
The way something flat becomes not flat at all.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful shift. So that leads me to think about chance. And how do you incorporate chance into the work? And what I mean by chance is sort of an event of the unexpected, or the presence of uncertainty even. Maybe you do expect things, but there's an element of uncertainty or question.
I think for me, it really is all about that in a lot of ways. I mean, I can set some, oftentimes in a series, I will decide maybe materials, or I'll decide palette. I do love a very limited palette, but given these restrictions, what's going to happen here? So even though I'm very sort of decisive about some of the foundational aspects of a series, then what is driving me all the time is just the curiosity of like what I'm going to respond, what's going to become interesting to me. I overuse that word, but on a daily way, I am working and laboring in the hopes that something will become interesting, and I don't know what that's going to be. And it could be the way that the material is sort of responding to heat or weight or application or something, or it could just be that I wasn't sure how a tiny little set of marks would read once I'd spent hours and hours and hours filling up a huge space, and then will that still feel interesting, or what will that become? And so I am always looking for the unexpected. If I can start to predict how I'm going to feel about it's time to work on a new series. If I just know the outcome, then I'm ready to try something novel.
Yeah.
It's just not as interesting at that point. Yeah.
Your point about curiosity really piqued my interest, and that's something that I'm thinking a lot about currently. And I think about curiosity as such a driver of a lot of things. It seems to be inherent to human nature. It drives all of our inquiries, our pursuits for knowledge, just to understand the world around us. And for you to understand your work, what are you most curious about, and what do you want us as viewers to be most curious about?
It's funny, I'm trying to think of all the different parts of that question. I can say this. The thing you asked last is I've had the quickest response about. Interestingly, I don't really have an expectation for the viewer or a viewer. I just don't. The second I start thinking about the viewer, I'm going to self-limit. I will start to make I'll predict, or I'll guess, or I'll assume, and I will feel like I'm compromising potentially about just doing whatever I'm compelled to do because I'm considering the viewer's experience. I mean, don't get me wrong, like when the work is up and my family comes later today for the opening, or friends, yeah, I mean, I have an ego like everyone. I sort of want people to think, that it wasn't all a waste of time, but I don't think about the viewer that much. Curiosity, I feel like sometimes that's a feeling that I'm driven by all the time. It's innate. And sometimes it's not there. And frankly, that always scares me a little bit. To me, I feel like the opposite of curiosity in my life is depression, or like a deep cynicism, both things that I'm very familiar with. And so curiosity to me is like, it's boundless, and it's hopeful, and it's forward thinking in the sense that like there's so much more to know, and so much more to learn, and so much more to feel. I also think as I get older, when I was younger, again, I think maybe this is a characteristic of youth, and also personality types, certainly, but I was anxious and really felt the drive to be certain, like to know the answers as somehow a mechanism for, being right, or being safe, or being whatever. And I don't feel like I know. I have basically now I have mainly questions and a very few answers about the most important things, I guess, but Yeah, curiosity to me, it just feels like it's so rich. There's always something that potentially I could just be so interested in that I haven't heard yet, I haven't seen yet, I haven't read yet, I haven't felt yet. And I hope for that in my work. Like, I hope that that will be my experience of my work, is that I'll be curious about something, I'll investigate it, and then I'll feel excited. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like that just kind of loops right back into that pursuit of liberation and expansiveness and freedom to just be, where you're doing whatever you set out to do or what you want to do, and not really, like, the outcome is not the most important part of that process. Yeah. Are there any other things that you want to share about your work today?
One of the thoughts that sometimes is in there, and sort of scratching at me or nagging at me, is because I work in abstraction, I'm most interested in abstraction. I do feel like there sometimes is a voice in me that, probably comes from the outside to a degree, that question of, like, should I be doing other work? Like, is it important or necessary to have work that's more explicitly about my Blackness, or like my cis womanness, or the fact that I'm a parent, or the fact that I have a trans child, or, I think, the political is always relevant, and I think maybe we're all egotistical enough to think that whatever time we're living in is the most political of times, which I don't think is the truth, but sometimes I feel that worry, that somehow to be an abstract artist doesn't speak enough to, the most important parts of myself and my life experience. And then, of course, like, I'm reminded that, there's nothing unique about me or my life, truly, and there's such a precedent and such a lineage for, like, Black abstractionists, and everywhere I look, they're Black artists and Black American artists in sculpture, in painting, making abstract work that's so important and so influential and so pivotal and all of those things. So, we touched on that a little, but I think I would also sort of want that to be understood about my work. Like, I'm a Black artist, I'm a Black woman. All of those things are essential. Like, that's the essential. And from there, then I make this work that oftentimes is about all the things you talked about, texture and line and shape and form and all of that. But it's not outside of who I am, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's all there.
Yeah.
It's imbued with it by by virtue of you having made
exactly.
it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's all.
It's a beautiful lineage, and it's a really beautiful show.
Oh, thank you.
As always.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's good to talk to you.
Likewise. I'm really glad we got to do this today. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you, Judith.
Thanks, Judith.
And thanks to all of you for watching.